They say that going to the summit of a mountain is only halfway, and nowhere was that more true than on Mount Everest on May 10th and 11th, 1996, when 8 climbers died after a brutal and unexpected storm caught them during their descent from the summit. 5 on the south and 3 on the north side. It was a disaster of disasters, certainly some of the most talked about hours in the history of mountaineering. And in part 2 of this 2-part series, why keep watching, right? We can't get enough of this story, of what it reveals about our own human nature. But in this part 2, we're going to reveal a little bit more about 2 key figures, the 2 key figures in the whole story. Scott Fischer, the owner of Mountain Madness, Rob Hall, the owner of Adventure Consultants, and honestly, the 2 people who are the actual key to the entire disaster itself. So let's get going on part 2 of the story about the 1996 Everest disaster. What it gets down to are 2 talented, ambitious guides who are undeniably tied to everything that took place on the mountain. In the previous episode, I talked about them passing Ed Viesturs of the IMAX team led by David Brashears, and Ed Viesturs asking them why they were going up and vice versa. Viesturs and the IMAX team did not like the conditions up high. Rob Hall, Scott Fischer, the clock was ticking. They were going no matter what. Now, perhaps they had just it was the luck of the draw, because there was a base camp meeting some days before that where they chose the slot of going to the summit on May 10th. But the world's best guides and the world's climbers who survive understand the mountain is what dictates the series of events on a mountain, and it seemed that Fischer and Hall were damned if they were going to be stopped on that mountain. Near the end, I'm going to offer my analysis and a wrap-up and a final thought that many people will not want to hear, but the truth is not always easy, so stay tuned for that. In part 1, there was a trigger warning, and that trigger warning was that something that Neil Beetleman said in an interview some years after the expedition is that Anatoly Bukriev was acting alone in climbing without oxygen. Many people portend that it was an agreement between Anatoly and Scott Fischer that climbing without oxygen was okay, but that is not the truth. Neil Beetleman said it in this interview and says that Anatoly was operating on his own. Does it make Anatoly a bad person? Not at all. Does it take away from the fact that Anatoly saved lives in the South Pole? Not at all. But did it change the series of events from the summit at 1 o'clock when Anatoly got there to about a few minutes later when Jon Krakauer arrived on the summit? Everything changed because of him not having oxygen, at least the series of events that he was involved with. So let's get to that. Here's how I explained it when I was recording previously for the part that was edited out from part 1. When Rob Hall reached the summit, it was well after 3 p.m. himself, an hour after the turnaround time. He waited for Doug Hansen, who had been a client with him previously. On that previous expedition with Doug Hansen, he turned him around close to the summit because of the turnaround time. But this time, after Hall summited, he saw that Hansen was close. He was not willing to let this one go by without getting Hansen on the top. He was giving it everything he possibly could. Obviously had tapped out every single reserve of energy that he had, leaving nothing for the descent. And as Doug came into sight, Rob descended down to Doug Hansen, and then it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Doug Hansen finally topped out with Rob Hall, and that was 2 hours, as Ed Viesturs says, beyond the turnaround time that Rob had otherwise so firmly insisted on. His passion to get Doug to the top, Viesturs said, sadly may have clouded his usually impeccable judgment. 3 to 4 p.m., the storm begins to develop. The nightmare is beginning to take shape on the mountain. Many climbers are still high upon the mountain, still very, very far from the safety of Camp 4. And it's said that the South African team, which was led by Ian Woodall, who determined to stay down in Camp 4 that day because of the bad weather, they were notably absent from almost all the rescue efforts. You cannot really find anything about them going out to assist the shitstorm that was taking place in front of them. And then Doug Hansen, sometime between 5 or 6 p.m. that afternoon, collapsed near the Hillary Step. Rob Hall stayed with him, unwilling to leave his good friend behind. Yasuko Namba, the Japanese climber with Adventure Consultants, she also collapses down near the South Col. Makalu Gao, leader of the Taiwanese team, he himself is caught in the storm and becomes disoriented, later being left for dead by the team. As it would turn out, Makalu Gao ended up next to Scott Fischer, who sat down after summiting extremely late. After all his clients had summited and moved back down the mountain, Fischer himself collapsed just below the balcony, where he never got up again. Around 6 or 7 o'clock, Fischer is found exhausted near the balcony, unable to continue down on his own. The storm intensifies and many climbers are stranded in the death zone. And I don't think I can say it any better than I did in my previous Scott Fischer video, where I became really emotional thinking about how hard it must have been for Lopsang, his trusted friend, and is Lopsang the protege of Scott Fischer. It's hard for me to go to that place, realizing how devastating it must be for people so close to you to lose their lives in the death zone during such an awful storm. Fast forward, early morning, May 11th, the storm continues to rage. There is a collection of individuals huddled together in the South Col area, unable to find the camp, at which time Anatoly Bukriev begins making his forays out throughout the South Col, looking for people, helping, guiding them back to their tents. Absolutely magnificent, superhuman, valiant effort by Anatoly, who did indeed save lives that day. Just really something that's important to talk about is that even Neil Beetleman, who to me, in the interviews I've seen with him and how his friends say about him, he's probably one of the most honest and forthright individuals and one of the least willing to criticize other climbers as well. He says that, well, many people say, well, because Anatoly said such and such in his book, The Climb, in the retort about decisions to use oxygen or not use oxygen, that he thought that a lot of the story changed from the time of the expedition to the book being published. And he, believe me, like, Neil was extremely good friends with Anatoly. It was devastating to have Anatoly lost in the avalanche on Annapurna shortly within a year or so after the expedition. But he did suggest that the book might not be literal with the events that took place on the mountain. I'm just putting it out there as a speculation. I'm not giving a full opinion on it. I'm just saying this is part of the controversy and why the decisions of Bukriev have been so disputed and discussed over the years since the storm took place in 1996. On May 11th, with Hall still not back down, it was about 4 something, almost 5 o'clock in the morning. Rob Hall radioed base camp and said he was on the south summit, confirming that he did survive the night. He reported at the time that Doug Hansen had gone missing, as had Andy Harris, his guide, and Hall had run out of oxygen because his regulator was too clogged up with ice. And now by 9 o'clock, apparently Rob Hall was able to fix his oxygen mask, but indicated that his frostbitten hands and feet were making it really difficult to traverse
the fixed ropes, and later in the afternoon, he radioed base camp asking them to call his pregnant wife, Jan Arnold, on the satellite phone, at which time he had a communication that was heard by everybody using radios on the mountain. One of the most heartbreaking conversations you could ever imagine. So I think the thing that kind of gets me about this Rob Hall thing is that he's trying to console his wife and she knows that she'll never see him again. And he's there, obviously about to die and probably almost delirious. And his last thing he says, "Sleep well, my sweetheart, please don't worry too much." Like, holy shit, right? That's just too much, you know? And so what gets down to, for me, is that even though I have opinions and maybe judgments on what decisions were made that led to this to build up into a complete catastrophe, is that these are human beings making decisions at a time when they are thinking that these are the right decisions. And in risk management, I've talked about this before, but professionals in the field talk about how one little decision, it doesn't create the catastrophe. It's 100 or 5 or 10 or 15 little teeny decisions that build up. And then when shit hits the fan, it's too late and lives are lost. And so as the daylight hours started happening on the 11th and the following morning, we have 5 people who are dead on the south side and 3 individuals from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition on the north side of the mountain who had lost their lives. And I'm going to put all the names of the individuals who lost their lives in the description. I'm not trying to gloss over any of those people or tell too much of one story or not enough of another. And that's why I have separate videos about Scott Fischer and Sandy Pittman and Anatoly. As the storm started to wane down, Todd Burleson and Pete Athans of Alpine Ascents International made their way up and did some truly heroic rescue work that included working with Beck Weathers, who they believed was a lost cause, and he was brought to his tent and left for dead. And Beck Weathers is his own miraculous story that deserves its own long video on, which will eventually happen. But they went up and endeavored to do as much as they could to assist in the rescue.
Certainly, strong people died and weak people survived. That's the story on mountains when the mountain lowers its wrath upon the human beings who wish to conquer it, to stand on top of it. Now, we must remember that both Hall and Fischer, adventure consultants and Mountain Madness, had high-profile journalists on their team, which was something that impacted every decision they made on the mountain. On Rob Hall's team was Jon Krakauer, who was writing a story for Outside Magazine. Ultimately, that story would become a book called Into Thin Air. And on the Mountain Madness expedition with Scott Fischer was Sandy Pittman, and she was reporting via satellite and blog post for NBC News. Super high profile. Behind it was Tom Brokaw, one of the great broadcasters of our time. So here's just one real thing I have to say, that there's been some criticism in comments about Jon Krakauer, which befuddles me, and I'm not quite sure why, other than that there are people out there who are jealous of his success and his absolutely, honestly insane talents. He reported it from his viewpoint and was probably his own harshest critic by far, which, when you consider that in comparison to Anatoly's book that came out a year or so after Into Thin Air was published, I didn't really see a lot of introspection in the climb. It mostly was what I did was right, and this is why I did it. And now, granted, it was written with the help of G. Weston DeWalt, a person, an English-speaking person who translated some of the interviews with Anatoly and spoke with him at length about things. But there was never like, I take responsibility for this going wrong or that going wrong. It was like, I'm perfect, I did it right, and I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's an amazing book, but when you look at the two, you really can't compare them. And when people say, oh, The Climb is better than Into Thin Air, they're totally different things about the same story. So that's just one aside that I wanted to put in there. Unfortunately, the material that Sandy Pittman created for NBC News is nowhere to be found, because I actually think it would be fascinating to look at it from an historical point of view on how it was being reported. And I think, maybe that goes part and parcel to the scorn that she received after the expedition and people being angry with her for what I don't know, but it may be not for thanking the individuals such as Anatoly, who essentially saved her life. But that's a whole nother video. I'll put the link to that Sandy Pittman Who's to Blame video in the description of this video. So a couple of key points that I just want to wrap through are the guides were ambitious. They were intent on succeeding. I think they thought, due to their unparalleled successes in the previous years, guiding-wise for Rob Hall, I mistakenly sent in the last video, he had 100% success. I meant nobody had died on his expeditions, but obviously Doug Hansen, his client, was turned around very close to the summit in the previous season on Everest. And I think Rob Hall felt somehow guilty for encouraging him to come back, and the possibility of turning him away a second time was perhaps too great for Rob Hall, which is a beautiful and poignant thing, but it ultimately really killed both of them. And then also Andy Harris, the guide for Rob Hall, who disappeared somewhere between the summit and the South Summit, was possibly there to save Hall and Doug Hansen. So 3 people died just trying to get Doug Hansen to the summit and then ultimately back down, right? The hardest part is getting back down, or it's only half the battle, so to speak. So that's that, the ambition. Scott Fischer, God only knows why he continued going back up to the summit after seeing all his clients coming back down, all of his clients whom survived, but point being made as well. There was a strong team and they all got back down fairly safely. The poor choice, I'm sorry to say, Scott Fischer making a poor choice of his lead guide being Anatoly Bukriev. Was he one of the greatest mountain climbers of his era? 100%. One of the great high-altitude climbers of that period of time, perhaps in all of history, like on the Mount Rushmore of greatest high-altitude climbers. However, his ambitions were not in sync with that of what Scott Fischer was interested in doing, and that was to protect the safety of his clients, with Anatoly going to the summit early and then having to depart back down to high camp to get warm and make tea for his clients as they made it back into camp. That's not a guide's job. That might be a Sherpa's job or an assistant guide's job. The guide's job is to be there with the clients in the difficult times when shit hits the fan, so to speak. So where was Anatoly as the clients were making their way down the Cornice Ridge, down below the South Summit? Now, granted, all of the Mountain Madness clients survived, so that's not a bad thing, but what about Scott Fischer? What would have happened if Anatoly had been in much closer proximity with Scott Fischer? Is there a possibility? Who knows? I'm going to talk about that at the end. One thing I think that was a critical error was that Scott Fischer made the choice, one of the Sherpas' choices, whether they wanted to climb on oxygen or not. Lopsang being the person of most importance to discuss right here who was not using it. He was completely exhausted. I spoke about that in part 1, about how Neil Beetleman encountered him at the South Summit, say he was barely able to move himself up there, let alone fix the ropes, which was the job that he was supposed to be doing with Ang Dorje from Adventure Consultants. Another thing that we've learned over time is, given the lack of experience of the clients that were on the mountain, there were not enough guides on the mountain. I think it was kind of, like fantasy thinking to think that given 7 or 8 clients on the mountain for each team, that there might only be 1 or 2 guides. There should have been more guides, or Sherpa should have been designated as official guides. Now, one of the things to talk about in this is that Rob Hall had some climbers as clients on his team who made an amazing decision, the fateful decision to save their own lives. At the time, I don't think they thought of it that way, but 3 of his clients decided as they neared turnaround time to turn back down the mountain, thinking that things were getting a little bit too close to the edge. Yeah, so the 3 who decided to turn back, all of them on Rob Hall's team, who should be lauded for their good sense and their understanding of that approaching turnaround time, 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That was John Task, Lou Kosciuszka, and Stuart Hutchinson. That was really prudent thinking and probably an agonizing decision on their part to turn around. It shows that there was some common sense there. And when you match that in relation to somebody also on the Adventure Consultants team, Beck Weathers, who was the one known for, if you will, kind of emerging from death in order to survive. Beck Weathers, who had put such absolute and inherent faith in the words of Rob Hall, who said, "You stay right here on the balcony until I get back." And hours and hours and hours later, there's Beck Weathers freezing literally to death, sitting on the balcony waiting to be brought back down, who had, against doctor's orders, at least common sense orders, continued up the mountain, even though, because of eye surgery he had had previously to the expedition, was losing his vision. Hello, if not 2 instances where Beck Weathers probably could have or should have died, he did not. Absolutely one of the classic side stories of someone not really listening to common sense, more being driven by ego, desire, and these words of Rob Hall that were taken as gospel. "Do not turn around until I come back." Complete madness. So if we've learned one thing in the death zone, that even guides, even the faultless Rob Hall, can say things that should not be heeded. You have to listen to your common sense. And how do you do that? How do you listen to your common sense when you've paid $70,000 to go be guided up there by the great Rob Hall, or Scott Fischer for that matter? Anyway, that's a side story. Perhaps the Beck Weathers thing should be a whole side story. There's probably 2 hours you could go off on a side swing right from there. I'm going to leave that poor guy alone. He has a great story and an amazing survival story, and also really became quite a remarkable public speaker of inspiration to many, many people. So I'm not denigrating him at all. And I think what he's done with life is do the very best that one could do when given a second chance. Now, this I had spoken about earlier, but another person who was making the decision to turn around was Doug Hansen. And it is just tragic that Rob Hall wanted so badly from the bottom of his heart to get his friend to the top. It led to their deaths. Cannot go into any more detail than I already have, but it is just a tragic story of not making the right decision. The summit will always be there, and not making it to the summit is not a failure. It's living is really what it is. One thing of note to talk to in that, now these other three who I had just mentioned who turned around, they were stuck, if you will, behind the Taiwanese team that was led by Makalu Gao, who had a very close encounter with death himself, who sat down next to Scott Fischer as Scott Fischer lay dying later that evening and into the next morning. But Krakauer wrote an article in Medium that I thought was really, really poignant, and he talked about the sort of psyche that enables one to keep pushing upward in the face of great pain and suffering. And he said how that's apt to incline one to ignore signs of clear and present danger. A perilously thin line demarcates laudable perseverance from reckless determination, which is one of the main reasons the slopes of Everest are littered with corpses. John Task, Stuart Hutchinson, Lou Kosciuszka, and Frank Fishbeck had each spent as much as $70,000 and endured great hardship to have this shot at the summit. All were driven men, unaccustomed to losing and even less to quitting. And yet, faced with a hard decision, they were among the few who made the right choice that day. Okay, so here we are with this opportunity to try to analyze it, to wrap a bow on it, to put it away in a box. Will never happen. We will always be learning from the decisions that were made that day, and hopefully all we can do is look into those decisions and see if there's a little bit about ourselves in there. When we find empathy and compassion for people, even if we disagree incredibly with the decisions they made, even if they lost their lives because of those decisions. And one was, as I mentioned earlier, the luck of the draw that Hall and Fischer had just out of the blue chosen that May 10th date. Had it been the IMAX team or had it been a different team that day, who knows? Things would have been different. Well, we know the IMAX team would have turned around. Another thing, Scott Fischer, too nice of a guy, not really the ultimate leader who just puts his fist down when things go the other way. He needed to put his fist down, put his foot on the ground and tell Anatoly, dude, if you do not use oxygen, I am firing you from this expedition and I'm not going to pay you the money that I promised you if you do not use oxygen. That should have happened. I don't think Scott Fischer had it in him to do it. We know that he called his support team at home back in the United States and was very upset about what was taking place on the mountain. I just think he was too nice a guy. I can understand that. I'm probably not built to be one of those tough leaders who just says, this is it, iron fist, my way or the highway, but that's what you need when you're running Mountain Madness or Adventure Consultants. Perhaps Scott was a little bit intimidated by the prowess and the talent of Bokriev, thinking, well, we'll just slip by and won't have to worry about it. Now, Bokriev did go on to redeem himself in the following year as he guided an Indonesian team to the summit of Mount Everest, doing an absolutely exceptional job using oxygen and doing everything in his power to be there for that team. So Anatoly knows how to do it. He just had to be, if you will, given the constraints or the guidelines to operate in. Rob Hall, who came off sounding kind of like a tough guy in base camp, this is our turnaround time. Now, apparently they hadn't decided if it was 1 or 2, at least even on the morning of May 10th, it wasn't known what time the turnaround time was, but his priorities really seemed to melt when they got up high. Doug Hansen was his Achilles heel, let's put it that way. And he broke every single rule in his own rule book, waiting for Doug Hansen, imploring Hansen to not turn around, to bring him up to the summit. It is a fateful decision. Rob Hall, beautiful, incredible, poignant act as a guide, but it led to their deaths and possibly to the death of Andy Harris, who disappeared on the Cornice Ridge around the time that they were 3 descending from the summit. Anatoly. I do think he was actually really a humble person deep inside. It's kind of a culture thing that I talk a lot more about in part 1 of this video, and even more so in my video about Anatoly himself, which I hope you'll check out. Link is in the description, blah, 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 all that stuff. But we know so much more about altitude physiology that we did not understand back in 1996. And Anatoly, I believe he really thought that he was better off without oxygen entirely, because he said if you have O's and then you run out, you're at a greater disadvantage. Now, I like to think that if he had kept that oxygen bottle with him on the way up to the summit, where he had jettisoned his backpack with and leaving it with Neil Beetleman, that extra bottle of oxygen, he could have waited on the summit and lingered for up to 6 more hours by using that oxygen, even on a low flow, maybe 8 hours at 1 or 1.5 liters a minute. So not using that oxygen, I believe he thinks that it might have weakened him had it run out, but that bottle of oxygen might have made all the difference in the world. And here's the kicker that I think that people don't want to hear. Would Scott Fischer still be alive had Anatoly kept that oxygen bottle with him and lingered up the mountain to facilitate the clients moving down the mountain, better utilizing the Sherpa power that was down at Camp 4? In my honest opinion, I believe the answer to that is very quite possibly yes. I'm not saying he's responsible for what happened to Scott Fischer. Scott Fischer was the one who decided not to provide walkie-talkies to all of the Sherpa. Even the clients should have walkie-talkies, or to the guides. That was a big problem there, so nobody knew where the other people were on the mountain. But had Anatoly the ability to be up on the mountain, up higher on the mountain for longer periods of time, he could have looked into the eyes of Scott Fischer and said, my friend, it is time to turn around. You have nothing to prove. All your clients are down there. We don't know. It's something we will never know. Now, here's the thing that has to be said. People are saying you're villainizing Anatoly. Not even remotely villainizing him. He was a phenomenal climber who made the difference between life and death with Sandy Pittman, Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, even assisting Neil Beetleman in the South Col there. So what Anatoly did was absolutely mind-boggling and superhuman almost. But, you know, we lost Yosuke Namba, we almost lost Beck Weathers, Doug Hansen, Andy Harris, Rob Hall, Scott Fischer, all died up the mountain. Who knows what a little bit more oxygen, better planning could have done. Speak about that again in part 1 of this video. So what have we learned? God only knows. Have we learned anything? Yes, maybe, but will people stop coming to the mountain? No, I highly doubt it. What do you think? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to know. Keep it respectful. This is not out of disrespect of anybody, especially those who are no longer here to defend themselves or to talk about what took place in '96. And in the meantime, do a good favor. Don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you.